Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sara Cochran, and I am Chief Curator here at the church, and it is my enormous pleasure to welcome Robert Lipsyte to be here today. So I think a few of you might know him. But he is obviously the award-winning sports writer for the New York Times, the Emmy-winning host of the public affairs show The 11th Hour, the author of 12 novels for young adults, as well as the extraordinary memoir, The Accidental Sports Writer, which, if you have not read it, I highly recommend. It was a great joy to read it. So with that, Robert, thank you again for being here, and thank you also for the conversations that we have had. Full disclosure, I know very little about boxing. Eric Fischel also knows very little about boxing. But we have the show upstairs, and I have it on good authority that when you first heard about the idea of a show on boxing, you thought it was a terrible idea. How badly did we do?
Well, yes. I mean, this is the creation myth for today. At dinner, actually the two people who gave the dinner, Tom and Levon, raise your hands. They gave the dinner, and across the table were Eric Fischel and April Gornick, and they said that they were going to have a show on boxing. And I said, I think that's really a stupid idea. And they said, why? And I said, well, I hate boxing. This is true. I hate boxing. It's brutal, it's exploitive, it has absolutely no redeeming social virtues. However, it's so much fun to write about. Probably like war, you know? And I love boxers. Of 65 years of covering sports, boxers are invariably the most centered, cooperative, amenable of athletes. They're not afraid of sports writers. In fact, because it's such a lonely existence, they love the attention and the company. You go into a baseball locker room, you're considered the green flies at the picnic. You walk into boxing training camp, do you have any jokes for us? They're desperate for attention. So I think I probably said all of this to Eric and to April, and they thought, he'll probably say something like that at this talk after the show opens. So let's have him aboard. And then you came in.
So may I ask what we might have got right upstairs?
What you got right was what I thought was going to be wrong. I thought the show was going to be all over the place, and that it would be basically incoherent. The show is all over the place, and it's basically incoherent. There's no single thread, which is, I think, the genius of this show. It's not really about boxing at all. It's about the artist and boxing. It's about the artist enhancing something else, in some places aggrandizing something else. Since they're in Italy, we'll talk about Eric Fischel and his painting a little later, I'm sure. And I think that in many ways it does what art is supposed to do, which is explain something to us, to open up, to give us an opportunity to really start to understand something that perhaps we had only seen in a kind of one-dimensional way. My single, and I'm going to stop in a minute, my single favorite upstairs is a video of Manny Pacquiao, great fighter, fighting all by himself. His opponent has been digitally removed. I found it an enormously disturbing piece. It was mental illness. It was suffering. It was fear. It was without the completion. You know, at the end of a fight, the two fighters hug each other. I mean, if it's been an honorable fight, no low blows, you know, no biting ears, stuff like that. And the reason that they're hugging each other is because they're thanking each other for being such great partners in this show. Couldn't have done it without you, man. And I think that without his opponent, you know, Manny is insane. Manny is lost. And I think that in many ways, that's really the psyche of so many boxers. That's what happens to so many of them. That's where boxers, unfortunately, end up. Can I stop for a minute?
Sure. I think that piece is by an artist called Paul Pfeiffer, who's been very interested in sports. And I think one of the really interesting things about that work is it is just so brutal. I mean, to see the reverberations of his head and body when they are kind of absorbing the blows, it is something uncanny because you don't see who's actually hitting him. But it is that the physical brutality of that piece that I find really compelling.
How did you find it? I mean, I could ask you that of so many places. How does one go about assembling such disparate things?
So the way that the show began was that Eric Fischel came to me and he said, I have an idea. I think we should do a show about boxing. And he was interested in the idea of boxing as a metaphor for the artistic struggle. And he had a wonderful self-portrait from 1931 called The Boxer, which is by Pierre Bonnard. And he had some other pieces, and he had a number of photographs of individuals such as Dylan Thomas, writers who had been involved in boxing. And I mean, I was surprised, and I said, okay. And I was like, well, you know, I have a background in surrealism and Dada, and so I said, well, you know, I knew about Jack Johnson and the really obsession of the European avant-garde with especially African-American boxers because so many of them went over to France. So I was like, yeah, you know, you know, and then I started to kind of think in my head. I knew Paul Pfeiffer's work. There were certainly other works that I knew of. And then you just start diving in. And, you know, what we ended up with a huge document, which was contemporary works of art about boxing, modernist works of art about boxing, historical works of art about boxing, and of course those go all the way back to Mesopotamia. I became interested in this idea of boxing is probably as old as we are, probably boxing and wrestling as old as we are, going back to war, also as old as we are. And then, you know, I because of interest, because of personality, I was really interested. I knew of Delilah Montoya's work, the work upstairs about the female boxers. So I immediately wanted to have more women artists in the show, and then also to start thinking about artists of color. And just as an aside, and then I will be quiet, what happened was that I realized women artists were using boxing for two disparate things, one of which is an embodiment of empowerment, in other words, a physical strength and an ability to protect oneself, and the other is as a metaphor for victimhood, and especially around domestic violence. And I was very interested in that. And then that made me think about the boxer, because the boxer is this kind of Schrödinger cat moment at the beginning of a match where they are both the winner and the loser of any match. And in reading about boxing, I became very interested in this idea of individuals who said, you know, he gave me a good match. That there was this real back and forth and relationship that was in this, and I found that very, very interesting. So that's how we find the work. Some you know, and then some you start looking, and then people start to talk to you about certain works. Yeah, the microcones was one of the last pieces to come into the show. That's the carved armor in the form of a pregnant woman, which is influenced by African art. But yeah, that came in the last month. So it was a very exciting project.
And there are surprises in it, too. I mean, one of the things that Lois and I liked a lot, is the Japanese artist? What's
yes. Shinohara.
Right. You'll see it. I think it's like pink and purple on yellow and orange or something like that. The brush strokes are really punches. I guess he painted the gloves and then hit it. And which sounds kind of, you know, oh, that's something my kid could do, you know, what you always hear about art. But the impact of it, you know, you really got a sense of, you know, the pain and the suffering. Things like that, you know, are really exciting. Yes. In the show. And then things that, you know, I think I would have tended to dismiss. There's a heavy bag right up here that's brocaded. And yeah, come on. And okay. And the second step is, well, swords into plowshare kind of thing. But then, you know, you just keep looking at it, and this, of course, is the wonderful part of art. You keep looking at it and thinking about it, and the Native American connection, the idea of nullifying something that's part of a lethal sport, and you realize that so much of art criticism is really nonsense. You know? You've given yourself the opportunity to say anything you want and take it as far as it goes until it hits $1 million. And I was very excited to hear that in France, if your painting, you know, sells for a lot of money, years and years after you've sold it, and it's been sold 5 times, you get 10%. That doesn't happen here. And I realized that boxing, in its sense, is corrupt and chaotic as the art world. And that's another interesting part of all of this. Now, the other really important work upstairs that you have to look at is Eric Fischl's. Remember, he's in Italy, so you can feel free to think anything.
We are taping.
Huh?
We are filming.
Yeah, but by then I'm out of the building. That Eric Fischl has kind of made himself the boxer, right? So it's a very interesting self-portrait of Eric in a kind of quasi-pose of the pugilist at rest. That's the name of, you know, the great statue of a guy who may or may not have just lost his last bout or is thinking of the next. Eric's hands are lightly wrapped in tape, which is a very important ritual in boxing. And they're splattered in red, which looks a little more like paint than it does like blood. And he has a kind of very dark and troubled expression in his face. Behind him are 2 or 3, I don't know if they're suggestions or relics of former masterworks of his, as if they were old boxing championship belts, you know, his former glory. And he's kind of sitting there, kind of glaring at you because he doesn't know what is going to happen next. Will he paint again? Will that next painting sell? Will his stock go up and down? And he's beginning to think like a boxer. This is kind of a terrible thing towards the, well, I'm not suggesting this, but towards the end of a career, you know, as the victories have piled up, the opponents are getting younger and tougher. The climate of the game may be changing. And here are you, you know, and you're still whatever it is that you ever had. Now, I found that an extremely moving work. I mean, you know, one of his really great works.
I find that really interesting, and I want to go back to what you were saying. I mean, you are a writer, first and foremost, and I think that writing is a revelatory process. As you write, you start to understand what you're writing. I mean, it's a way of also exploring one's thoughts. I think that there is an excitement in writing about new art, which has to do with breaking boundaries. And I would suspect that for you, in writing about boxing, one of the things that was really interesting for you were, sure, what was going in the ring, but also what was going on around the ring. You're someone who has been interested in the sociological, the political, the psychological aspects of this sport. And in reading The Accidental Tourist, I realized that in both sports, the accidental sports writer, thank you very much. In writing about sports, just as in writing about art, there are segments of society that would just like sports to be sports and art to be pretty. And I think that for me is an unexpected point of contact.
Well, we want art to be inoffensive, at the least. You know, we don't want it to provoke us or to, you know, make our children crazy. But I think that writing about...
No, it's better.
I think Sam can fix this.
Let me try. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that, well, in any case, writers love to write about boxers because it's so easy for them to identify. Back in the old days, when I was covering boxing, and boxing training camps and boxers were so accessible, there would be a flood of, you know, Norman Mailer, Bud Schulberg, Baldwin, Plimpton, on and on, of writers who came and really thought that they were fellow boxers, you know, introducing themselves to Muhammad Ali or Sonny Liston or whoever was the boxer in training. And the idea of you work all by yourself and then you publish something, have a fight. You go out half naked to be judged by people who don't really understand what you're doing, who are inferior to you. And they all actually, Mailer certainly, all actually felt that way. The fight itself was really secondary. This idea of the boxer, the loneliness of the boxer, the willingness to suffer, to sacrifice, to take chances, and to get hurt. And they all got hurt. I mean, there's no romance. The reason I hate boxing, there's no romance in it. I mean, some of my most vivid memories are buying ties. Remember ties, guys? Buying ties in the Hotel lobby of where a championship fight was going to take place in that town, from a guy named King Levinsky. King Levinsky was a heavyweight contender of his time, and now he was just, a guy on Dream Street, lurching around and mumbling and kind of grabbing you in the lobby and pressing a tie. You had to buy a tie from King Levinsky. And there were an awful lot of King Levinskys out there. And, Joe Louis. Joe Louis was a terrible rambling wreck at the end, and they all were. I mean, forget about football. These guys, and of course, the worst of all, Muhammad Ali. And with the knowledge that it was going to happen, not that it could happen, but that it was going to happen, because what they were doing was so exalting, so thrilling, so wonderful, and so narcissistic as a boxer in training. And it was wonderful, and of course it was wonderful for, Mailer and Bud Schulberg and all, and even people who considered themselves artists, like Leroy Neiman, who is unaccountably in this show.
It's a very good Leroy Neiman. It's from '74. I mean, and again, a lot of questions about. Yeah, I will maintain that it's a good Leroy Neiman. I love the composition. It's Muhammad Ali through Joe Fraser's legs, seen in kind of looking up. It's a very interesting image, that was an interesting set of conversations.
Yeah, well, I don't think he adds anything to the conversation. I don't think he ever has. I've never liked his work, and I've never liked him. So I'm sorry you're dead, Leroy. But look at some of those other things. There are things that look at first banal, but that picture of Jack Johnson, whoever thought, of course, he's wearing a black shirt with glitter on it. That was Jack Johnson. This kind of flamboyant, man who was jailed for his, quote, unbearable blackness. The Sonny Liston by Paul Davis, who lives in East Hampton, I guess. Yeah. It's a wonderful print of one of the only two athletes I've ever covered who scared me, who physically made me scared. Sonny Liston and Jim Brown, who just died recently. And, he captures that glare, that kind of wonderful look. So, I mean, there are wonderful moments, and there's a photograph of Muhammad Ali that I had never seen before. It's, I think, on the middle floor. He's kind of like this. His ring is very prominent. And you could see, just how much he's hurting.
I think that was taken the year before he died. Mm-hmm. And it was Platon, who's the portrait taker for the New Yorker. And that label has a really wonderful quote where Muhammad Ali says, what was great about his career was not him, it was the fact that people bought into what he was trying to do, and that it was a community that carried him. And that was what was really great, which, just an incredible statement at the end of his life. Yeah.
I think of him, beyond everything else, as the most gallant patient of our time. His Parkinson's was very severe, and even before it got that severe, when he lit the Olympic torch, mm-hmm. where apparently, as I learned later, hot wax dripped back on his hand, and he never let it show. Wow. Amazing. And one of the thrilling things I learned here from this show is that Parkinson's patients are taking boxing lessons. because the movement apparently does great things for their own healing. I actually, last time I was at the show, a woman came up to me and she said, I'm a boxer too. She was very old, my age. She was small, and I said, something. And she said, yes. I said, you're not how can you be a boxer? And she said, well, that I'm taking boxing lessons right here, somewhere in town.
Mm-hmm. At the gym.
For Parkinson's patients. And apparently it has done wonders. That's kind of...
We're doing an event with them, the Parkinson group out of Stony Brook, if you're interested. It's on the website. I don't remember the date, but please look that up on the website. Robert, I want to ask a rather provocative question, because at the opening, somebody said this to me, and I find it an interesting idea. They said boxing is a sport that's dying. That if you look at the beginning of the 20th century, the three biggest sports in America were boxing, horse racing, and baseball. And that boxing has just kind of lost the mass appeal. And obviously, given the questions about the injuries that are sustained, that boxing is something that will fall by the wayside.
Well, hopefully. As I said, there's no reason for it to exist, except for exhibits like this and history. Horse racing fell away. It was very important. Those were the three sports when I broke on the scene in 1957. Horse racing has been kind of superseded by sports gambling and lotteries. I mean, it was the only acceptable legal way that you could bet. Well, it's not necessary anymore. We know how corrupt it is, the way these horses are dying, and the rich guys, who own the horses and all, are putting their money into other things. Baseball, on the flip side, has hung on because the rich guys own the teams, the billionaires own the teams, and they have made cities through the stadiums, absolutely hostage to their businesses, which leaves boxing, which has been replaced to a large extent by mixed martial arts, which is much more violent, gives itself off to better storylines, and brings us a new class of corruption. Boxing is totally corrupt. It has always been corrupt. There is no commissioner of boxing. There is no central intelligence. There is no president. There are like 9 different heavyweight champions because, we could have the church heavyweight champion of the world. And we know who it would be. But I think that I think that it is fading. And so when I started covering boxing, Madison Square Garden would give each boxing writer a brown envelope full of cash. Now, it wasn't to write a good story about the fight itself. It was to write 5 good stories in the week preceding the fight about how amazing this fight was going to be, to sell tickets. And when you got to Vegas, there would be not only a brown envelope, but a woman. There were no women's sports writers covering boxing at that moment, but they would have found a man or a woman for her. And that was what boxing was about. Most fights were fixed. Now, not fixed in the sense of, in the dressing room, hey kid, you got to tank this one so you get a chance to fight the champ. No, not like that. They would just, it was a mismatch. They would just make sure if you were a boxer on the rise up, that you wouldn't have to fight somebody who could hurt you. So in that sense, it was totally fixed. But the excitement of it, the romance of it, nothing, Super Bowl, nothing, World Cup has ever really felt like the moments before a heavyweight championship fight, particularly in some venue like Madison Square Garden or a Vegas casino. And it's just the marvelous electricity in the air of these two men who had come from different parts of the world, to become, in those days, Mr. Man. What do you think about the masculinity involved in boxing?
Super complicated. Super complicated. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a question I wanted to talk to you about. I mean, we have two works upstairs, one by Ralph Gibson and one by Robert Mapplethorpe, of boxers. And they have incredible physique, they have incredible muscle definition, and one has his head cut off so it's more difficult to know what he's thinking. But the other one appears lost in thought, and there is a vulnerability to that. And, there is something about, even in Joel Pfeiffer's work, there's one where one boxer appears to be falling back, but there's these kind of swagged elements in the composition. It looks like he's falling onto a four-poster bed with the other boxer falling on top of him. And again, maybe that's part of the kind of mythology of boxing, the fact that, hate may be part of it, but I don't think you can be a professional boxer just on hate. You've got to have the physique, you've got to have the power, you have to have the training, you have to have the psychology. And so I think that quick kind of juxtaposition of boxing versus, as something violent and hateful versus love as in some other way, I don't see that. I see a very interesting set of questions around masculinity in boxing.
And give me one.
The idea, first of all, that they're half naked. And they're these exquisite physiques. That's easy on the eye. Second of all, it's all about kind of a posturing. And all of that kind of trash talking is also about a certain amount of posturing. Mm-hmm. The shininess of the shorts, the kind of robes that are worn, the very tenderness of the way that perhaps managers look after the boxers. It's a very interesting and complex moment, and I don't see it as purely masculine. I think for so long it has been a sort of crucible of masculinity, a way of individuals from more difficult circumstances, be it racial or social, to quote unquote get out. But it's not been that. And the images of women boxing, also point to that toughness as being something that's human rather than masculine, which I think is interesting.
I think that's a very interesting analysis. Something I would add to that is the idea that this is masculinity under control. It's masculinity that's owned. Now, the first boxers, as well as the first athletes, professional athletes in America, were enslaved men. they boxed for their plantation, and if they boxed well enough, made enough money, they could buy their freedom. The name Tom Molyneux was one of the first great champions, went to England, and where he was certainly accepted more than here. And on, really right up to Muhammad Ali, who was owned by the Louisville Sponsoring Group, 11 rich, white Louisville businessmen, men who have, as he said, the complexion and connection to give me good direction. But they owned him. Then later, other entities owned him. So all these boxers, are under control. Their masculinity is limited to, kind of monstrous, totally monstrous promoters like Don King, only in America, with his hair. He's a terrible man. I mean, now the reason that now we're getting back to my time, the reason that Big Whitey let Don King run boxing was because who else but a killer, Don King was a credited killer, could control these hyper-masculine beasts, Mr. Man. And that was the image of boxing back in my day. We don't feel that way. We may be the last generation, that remembers that. And the kids nowadays, if they even remember who Muhammad Ali is, certainly are thinking about mixed martial arts. But yeah, the masculinity part is so interesting.
It's also interesting because obviously coming from the UK, boxing was in the mid-19th century. The Marquess of Queensborough came up with a number of rules, and that was 3-minute rounds, 1-minute rests, and a defined space in which the boxing was going to take place, and the gloves.
Which were all instituted to increase the violence. They were finding out that bare knuckle fighting just wasn't working out because you would break your knuckles on some of these hard heads, and then the later rounds, you didn't have punching power anymore. Now, with your hands tightly wrapped in tape and gauze, and you don't make, as my wife points out, you don't make a fist in a boxing glove. You are curled around the inner leather of the glove, so you can keep punching on and on because your knuckles are protected. Emil Griffith wouldn't have killed Benny Kid Paret if in a bare knuckle fight. He would have broken his hands. So the Marquess of Queensberry rules, this kind of codification, was to make it into more violent, more interesting, more saleable sport, which they did.
And also one that was practiced by the upper classes in the United Kingdom. I mean, the vast majority of lords in the United Kingdom were taught to box and did box. Now, obviously, I cannot vouch for how well, and
not at all, because what we always said was that hell will freeze over when there's a decent British heavyweight.
We like drinking too much. So I did work on this artist called Francis Picavia, who was a kind of bad boy of Dada and Surrealism, one of the first people to paint an abstract painting, one of the first three. He kind of went off the rails and he went down to the south of France and he needed money. And one of the things he did was he organized themed parties. And the first party that he organized was called the Boxing Party. And he essentially brought down a lot of the big African-American boxers, professional boxers, and he had British lords go up against them. And they didn't really do too well. But again, this idea of that kind of entertainment is really interesting. And also that kind of class struggle is very interesting too. It's really specific. And so I find that very interesting. You have talked about the rise of American football at kind of coming up at that moment that boxing sort of started to go down. And I think what is interesting in what you're saying about boxing is this perhaps social movement away from violence, but that it's only tempered because we have the mixed martial arts and because we have boxing. It doesn't seem like we're getting the violence out of sports. Is that something we should want?
I don't know. I mean, obviously people don't want to get violence out of sports. I mean, that's part of what sports offers. Certainly in football, I mean, does it repel you? I mean, does it disgust you?
I mean, my deep, dark secret is that...
Do you watch American football?
No, I've been to a lot of bullfighting, and I think it's the closest we can get to the cathartic feeling of ancient Greek theatre. But I understand that it is a profoundly violent and unpleasant thing. Nevertheless, as A.L. Kennedy wrote about bullfighting, which in some ways applies to boxing, every day a bullfighter fights, they take their life in their hands. Mm-hmm. And most of us do not actually have that courage or live in that way, so who are we to judge? I'm not saying that that is an argument for bullfighting. I think it is something that is interesting in thinking about it.
Well, I mean, I think that maybe one thing to think about is that American football is 70% played by black men, and boxing is primarily poor boys, most of whom are men and women of color. Maybe if they were all white, there would be a greater push to ban them or cut off the violence, but nobody much seems to care. And it's a ticket out, as it has always been. I mean, that's why, boxing itself should not be romanticized in that way, although it's hard not to.
But maybe that's a lot like athletics and sports in universities, where, the universities make tremendous amounts of money off these athletes who, until very recently, have not been able to take sponsorship and take advantage.
Yeah, but that's only two sports. Whenever they talk about university sports, they talk about how many of the athletes absolutely graduate. That's right. The fencing team, the tennis team, the divers. But meanwhile, and they're predominantly white. And then, of course, basketball and football are black. So these are our gladiators. And the point is, accept it or shut up. I mean, and it's very hard. It's very hard for the media to cover this on any kind of regular basis. Although one thinks that they should, they can't. The first time I went to a Final Four, the NCAA basketball tournament, I was very naive. I've never covered very much basketball. I looked down, and 9 of the 10 guys running up and down the court were black. So, wow, that was kind of interesting. And then I went online, and both teams came from universities that had 6% black student body. you know? And so I wrote it. Everybody thought that was very smart at the time. And then they thought it was so smart, they sent me back the next year. And the second time, I wrote it. The sports editor said, you know, I think you've written that already. So if you go back, is some other angle you could find? And I think this is kind of a metaphor for what happens to a lot of journalistic coverage of stuff that's right in front of you. And nobody wants to hear that stuff anymore. You know, enjoy the goddamn game. And that's exactly what you talked about before. The line is shut up and dribble.
Yeah. So I do want to open it up to questions, but before I do that, I wanted to ask you if you see that there have been significant ways that sports coverage has changed since you have left it, and are there reasons to be excited and hopeful?
Well, there's reasons to be excited and hopeful because sports writers of today are so much better educated, smarter, more sophisticated in social ways than certainly in my time. But I think that they operate under some of the same constraints that, you know, who owns the press. I mean, they've just fired everybody at ESPN. I used to be the ombudsman at ESPN, and I think they could fire everybody except Tom Juneau. They could. It was right here. They could fire everybody at ESPN, but Tom Juneau, it'd be fine. The guy who was my immediate handler at ESPN, you know, just got fired. You know, kind of brilliant editor. Why? Because Disney's not making enough money. So what does that have to do with sports? And so many other issues are involved. The New York Times has more or less decided that sports is not worth covering. And they may be right. The only thing that they really cover now is European soccer. And that's because they are stretching to become a global empire. And I think that sports is becoming less and less, as it was in my time, a crucible of character. You know, a place where young boys learn to be men. And it's become another aspect of Marvel Comics, of the entertainment industry, of superheroes. And, you know, maybe that's okay. Maybe we just have to readjust our thinking and make sure that kids don't, you know, look up to sports figures for the wrong reason. I mean, I look up to LeBron James. I really do. Because here is the only athlete that I really know of who has taken control of his own narrative since high school. He was like 13 years old, 14, whatever he was. He found himself a private high school that would take him and all his friends as their basketball team. And they went there, and they won. And he has kept doing that. Skipped college, smart, and moved into the pros, where he has done the same thing of kind of assigning himself the next place that he would play. So everything has been on his terms. Now, how many other athletes will ever be able to do that? I don't know, but that's certainly the model. The only really positive model in sports now is in women's sports, particularly in the women's basketball, the WNBA. You know, what was amazing about them? They make so little money that they have to, in their off-season, play in Russia and forget, you know, that they're bringing in some some pot with them, or oil, the Brittany Griner story, of course. And, but these women, and it was your team, the Atlanta Dream, wasn't it? You know, they, their owner was a Republican senator, a white woman, who was about as right-wing as you could find. And that team stood up and campaigned for her eventually winning opponent, black man. I mean, talk about, you know, courage. Talk about what you're supposed to get out of sports. You know, fighting the power, standing up for what's right. Wow, they did it. It didn't come from boxing, or other than Colin Kaepernick, it didn't come from football. The thugs who play baseball never happened there. So I think that we have to readjust our thoughts about sports and put it exactly in its place. And now that I'm no longer writing on a daily basis and have no skin in the game, we can ban them all.
Are there questions in the audience?
Peter.
Aside from banning them all, if you had great grandchildren coming along, what sports would you advise them to start or encourage them to start?
Well, I think that they're at the level, whatever level they play at. I mean, flag football, I think it's a beautiful sport. It's a wonderful to see that. I think basketball is still a lovely sport. But I mean, you know, middle and upper class people rarely send their kids into professional sports. I mean, maybe they would crew on America's Cup yacht or something, but and I think that's very interesting. That idea of sports as a ticket out, you know, is basically a working class and underclass exploitation. But yeah, I mean, play tennis, play. Play golf. You know, I think it would be fun. Box. I mean, as long as you don't do it professionally. You know, I mean, I think almost any sport, the discipline of it, you know, what you learn from it, the collective play, it's kind of wonderful. Volleyball. Yeah. Who do you make your kids play? What do you?
Lacrosse.
Lacrosse. Well, that's really coming up. That's going to be the new football. That's a great sport. It really is. Yeah. Hi.
Hi. What do you think about the way sports is being functioned today, where there's no countries and there's no teams? It's whoever get paid more go to play wherever whoever paid him. It used to be that people were proud in their town sports, in the country sports, and now there's no borders. If Saudis would pay you more, you go there. How do you feel about that kind of business in the sports?
Well, I feel that really that anything an athlete can make, he or she should. That they've been exploited for so long, that the elements of sports are owned by billionaires who don't even make their major profits from the sports, but you know, kind of use the sports as a kind of a toy, a sandbox. You know, one of the most interesting things is, again, this is going back a few years when sports writers had real accessibility, is to stand in a major league clubhouse and watch when the owner swaggers in with some schmuck who was, you know, the high school hero in sports when he went to school. And he's showing, that hero, that he really won the game, because all these 25 guys sitting in their locker room belonged to him. So I remember the first time, I've seen it a couple of times, but the first time I saw that, I was, whoa, this is what sports is really about. So some guy, who, decides to jump from an Italian team to Barcelona to somewhere else, and makes everybody crazy, I think he deserves to, and he should. And I think there are no more of those kind of rules, because nobody is, feeling that way, that they are being truly represented. I don't think that exists anymore in the real world.
You mentioned sports being a crucible for character, and I think that Theodore Roosevelt felt that way. Wasn't he a boxer? And is he the only president that you know of that was a boxer?
Who is that?
Theodore Roosevelt.
I don't even think he was that much of a boxer, was he? I mean, the whole. Yeah, I think he boxed a little bit in the way that Sara pointed out, that the gentry in London would hire black enslaved men who had come from America, to teach them the fancy. And part of it was the connection to low life. Now, boxing is low life. And I think that there was always an excitement of that kind of connection. Your trainers were street kids. But I think that, I'm sure, so Rockefeller, he went to Dartmouth. Maybe he played soccer. I don't know.
Well, I think Roosevelt was sickly.
He was a sickly kid, yeah.
And so he went into boxing
Yeah.
to become stronger.
Right. And he did. And he had the Rough Riders, right?
Oh, sorry.
I'm curious. First of all, it's been a fabulous presentation. And I'm curious, you said there were two athletes, Sonny Liston and Jim Brown, that scared you. And I can understand why, not that I met him personally, Sonny Liston would scare somebody, but why did Jim Brown scare you?
Because Jim Brown, does everybody know who? Jim Brown operated on a low level of rage. He was simmering all the time. And in his presence, you could feel that at any moment he was going to just knock your head off. And okay, war story. Okay, Toronto, 1966. I'm having dinner in a Chinese restaurant with three of the biggest black guys, most important black guys in America. Jim Brown, later, Jim Brown, Carl Stokes, who would become mayor of Cleveland, and Dick Gregory. And I was there because I was writing Dick Gregory's autobiography at the time. So we had a very jolly, pleasant there. I was there for an Ali fight. And we had a very jolly dinner. The end of dinner, the check comes. This elderly Chinese waiter hands it to me. Dick Gregory and Louis, that's his brother, Carl Stokes, immediately start laughing uproariously. And start this banter about, these colored guys don't understand, who's the power in America. So Jim Brown slowly rises out of his chair and reaches for the waiter. And Gregory and Stokes are athletic guys. They kind of each grab a big arm, and then Jim relaxes and he laughs afterwards. But that's Jim Brown, and he was he was. I think that one of the reasons why we were delighted for so many years with O.J. Simpson, my theory, is that O.J. Simpson was the antidote to Jim Brown's black rage. Here was this absolutely smiling, really lovely, crazy, as it turned out, not quite black guy, who hung out with white TV executives, who wherever he went kind of cast a testosterone shower that we could all huddle under. And he was jolly and gracious and fun. And Jim Brown was not. I mean, Jim Brown was a better running back, I think. So, I mean, he had a real impact. And of course, became a big action hero, and he became the, I believe, the first black leading man to have sex on screen with a white woman. Raquel Welch, yes. Sorry. Here's a mic right next to you.
Did you play sports as a youth, and what prompted you to get into sports journalism? And part two would be your favorite fight of all time.
I didn't play sports at all. I was a fat kid. And all my upper body strength comes from carrying books home from the library. I had no particular interest in sports. Nobody in my household did. My parents weren't interested in sports. And
tell us your break. Tell us your big break.
Big break. Well, yeah. I mean, so what happened was I was on my way to Pomona to get a PhD in romantic English poetry, something substantial. And I needed a summer job to get out there, and I answered an ad for an editorial assistant in the New York Times. Editorial assistant was copy boy, and it was in the sports department. If it had been in the shipping news department, we would be talking to you about yachts today. So I was not interested in sports. I was not interested in sports, but the Times was looking for feature writers.
You just have to
What
push.
am I doing
You
wrong?
keep pushing there.
The Times was looking for feature. They were interested in people who could write features who didn't necessarily know what they were writing about. And so for jokes, in 1962 they sent me to the Mets' first spring training, which was great fun. And then in 1963, when Cassius Clay challenged Sonny Liston for the heavyweight championship, which he had no right to do. That's about the chaos and corruption of boxing. He had not in any way moved up a ladder that would have put him in position to fight for the heavyweight championship. But boxing needed a sacrificial lamb for a big fight for closed circuit television. And this guy was beautiful, and he wrote poetry. Well, somebody wrote poetry. And so the boxing writer, the important man at the New York Times, because boxing was important, felt that going all the way down to Miami was not worth his time for a fight that would last one round and would be shameful and dishonorable. And then he looked around and he said, "Kid's not doing anything. Send him." So they sent the kid. And what they told me was, as soon as I got to Miami, rent a car, drive back and forth between the arena where the fight was going to be held and the nearest hospital, so that I would waste no deadline time following Cassius Clay into intensive care. And I did it. And then I drove to his training camp. We had yet to meet. There were 4 little guys in terry cloth jackets on the stairs, and they were trying to force their way down as I was coming up, and the cops wouldn't let them leave because, as I found out, they had gone to Liston's camp to take a group photo with Champ. They were a touring British band. And Liston took one look at them and said, "I ain't posing with them sissies." And so they were sent down to Cassius Clay's camp for the second best photo. He wasn't there yet, but it was important for Cassius Clay to get a picture with these guys. So they were all pushed up the stairs, and I went with them. We were locked into an empty dressing room. They started banging, "Let me the fuck out of here." And I introduced myself. I'm Robert Lipsyte of the New York Times. And John said he was Ringo. And Ringo said he was Paul. And they kept banging, and I interviewed them. Who do you think is going to win? The door bursts open, and there is the most beautiful creature any of us have ever seen in our lives. The Beatles gasped. They really gasped. And then he said, "Come on, Beatles, let's make some money." And so he led them out of the dressing room into the boxing ring where he would be training. And although I would prefer you don't do it right now while I'm talking, I would like you to go on YouTube to Cassius Clay and the Beatles, and you'll see the scene. He lined them up in the ring. He tapped the first one. They went down like dominoes, like they had practiced this. And then they jumped and formed a pyramid so that they could reach up and punch him. It lasted maybe 10 minutes, and then they went their separate ways. God knows what happened to any of them, of course. And that was it. And that is the moment when the 1960s began. Kennedy.
What was your shock at the fight itself?
Pardon that?
What was your reaction to the fight itself as it developed?
Oh, well, I came to love him that week. I spent a week, and most of the sports writers were older, because boxing was important, and they hung out with Liston. Joe Louis hung out with Liston. All the great fighters went to hang out with Liston. But the younger guys hung out with this guy who was wonderful. And we would always say at night, when the day was over, "I hope he doesn't get hurt." I'd really like the chance to interview him again some year. I mean, we really felt very protective of him. The odds were 7-1, which is off the charts. And I think the first glimmer was just before the fight began. They came into the ring, Liston and Clay. Referee's instructions, shake hands, blah, blah. And Cassius Clay was much bigger than Liston. We had never realized, we had never seen them together. We had never realized that before. He was bigger, he was broader. This was we thought this was David and Goliath. Something's not right here. And then, of course, he took absolute control, and thrillingly, he as you know, he won the fight, which was really good for him. But of much more importance, it made my career.
Well, do you have a question?
But if you wanted to end
Sherry.
there, it's such a great way to end.
One last question.
One last question. One of the themes in the show, this is incredible. Thank you so much. You've both been fabulous, Robert and Sara. I think seeing the two of your dialogues evolve over the last few months, we all imagined that you two were going to be great, but it was even better than anybody could have predicted. My question, one of the themes in the show that I think comes through in the show, as you said, there are so many, is this idea, is an element of fragility and vulnerability within the self, within the boxer. And I was curious from your experience having so many relationships with people like Ali, Mike Tyson, if boxers are particularly as people emanate a sense of fragility, of vulnerability, or sensitivity?
Well, I think they are not necessarily aware of such, and they can't be. Remember, this is each fight, and we're talking about on the upper levels of boxing, certainly the big heavyweights, but all the classes. These are kind of quests that they're on. And they're surrounded, if they're rich fighters, if they're just starting out, they could be very much alone. But they're surrounded by people, trainers, managers, on the high contender and championship level, court jesters, people who will be in their camp to keep their spirits up. Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. That was created by a man named Boudini, who was Muhammad Ali's court jester. And his job was just to make him laugh and make him feel good, make him not feel fragile, make him feel that he was strong and that he was getting stronger, and that there was nothing that could really stop him, that this was all worthwhile. You brought up a question a few days ago about the thought of one of the questions the show asks is, what's worth fighting for? Yeah. Now, in the very beginning, and you can see this in so many of the works, in the very beginning, it's really about money. Most boxers are poor kids who have a limited number of avenues, now with affirmative action gone, but have a limited number. But as they move up, and they're making money, now it's the quest. It's the quest to beat other men, to be bigger than other men, to become a contender, somebody who is challenging, and then eventually becoming the champion, the best in the world in what you do. I mean, how many of us, it would be so subjective for us, are you the best in the world at what you do? But they would know. And I think that, that's really what it comes to be about. And I think that, you want to keep the King Levinskys and their ties away from these guys. They shouldn't have to see them. They shouldn't have to talk to all the punch drunk, which was a very accurate term. I've never met an aged boxer who didn't at least slur his words. It became very apparent long before Muhammad Ali retired that he didn't quite make his tongue work. It was terrible. His own doctor eventually quit because he didn't want to be it. So these are all things that they're fighting against, that they're denying, and that they're in denial. And like football players who've been damaged, you ask them at the end, was it worth it? They say it was worth it. It was worth it. the thrill, the high, the winning. And most of them say it was not so much dominating and beating another man as it was, stepping back and hearing the roar of the crowd for them.